Chambre de Commune. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022, and therefore members can attend in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Should any technical challenges arise, please advise me. Please note that we may need to suspend for a few minutes as we need to ensure that all members are able to fully participate. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083H and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, November 14th, the committee is commencing its study of privacy concerns in relation to the ArriveCAN application. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses today.
For
the interpreters, I just want to make sure that sound tests were completed. Were tests completed, Ms. Jeffries? Or Ms. Clerk, Madam Clerk? We don't do any sound tests for people in the room, so for the next panel, we'll let you know when the tests are done.
To welcome our witnesses today from Digital Public. Is it De Digital Public? Oh, it's en français. I'm so excited to speak French. Bianca Wiley, who's a partner, and as an individual, Mr. Matt Malone, who's the assistant professor at Thompson Rivers University. Ms. Wiley, the floor is yours, and you have 5 minutes for an opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about ArriveCAN today. Our firm, Digital Public, does work focused on digital transformation, both in government and more broadly. I'm sharing thoughts today based on my experience working with software as a product manager and working as a facilitator to support democratic process. There is a long list of what went wrong with ArriveCAN. At the top of the list is the inequity in public service delivery it created and the damage it did to public trust in government, particularly during a public health crisis. We can discuss the specific details of what went wrong together, but for the purpose of these short remarks, I'm going to share 3 proposals that may help us avoid replicating our ArriveCAN mistakes. The recommendations fall under 3 headings: equity, sovereignty, and democratic accountability and oversight. So first, on equity. Most importantly, ArriveCAN should have always been a voluntary app. It never should have been mandatory. So the first proposal here is to implement mandatory redundancy in our digital public service delivery. What this means is that if there is a digital way to access a public service, there always, including in emergencies, needs to be a non-digital mode as well, one that is properly staffed and delivers just as high quality and experience. 2 very telling things happened over the course of ArriveCAN that illustrate why we need this kind of policy as a gating mechanism to force equity in public service delivery. 1, the government roundly ignored the federal, provincial, and territorial privacy commissioners who stated clearly that technology used during the pandemic must be voluntary in order not to destroy public trust. From the 2020 joint statement by the commissioners, supporting public health, building public trust, and I quote, "Consent and trust. The use of apps must be voluntary. This will be indispensable to building public trust. Trust will also require that governments demonstrate a high level of transparency and accountability." End quote. 2, the public service should have had a deep and clear knowledge of the access and digital literacy issues, the discomfort, and the fear that mandating this technology created for people in this country. This is about public service ethics. Yes, we were operating under emergency powers. If anything, this should have increased the care taken to support comfortable human experiences. Instead, the moment was used to accelerate an underlying desire to modernize the border. Our work of democracy is easing access to each other's care. The mandatory nature of this app did the opposite. It created barriers. It devalued the work and possibility of the public service. Secondly, on sovereignty, second proposal. Do not deliver public services through apps and app stores. Full stop. We should not be building the delivery of public services with and through digital infrastructure that we don't own or control. This should be a non-starter. The app stores are for consumer products. They are not for government service delivery. There's also a significant issue with moving the work done by the public service away from physical interactions and into private devices done in private places. Lastly, one of the problems with honing in on procurement means we talk about purchasing, and we skip over what it would mean to build our digital infrastructure, which is a conversation that we need to have more of. Finally, on democratic accountability and oversight, a third proposal, create an independent public advisory board to oversee ArriveCAN's ongoing development and use. This will help address transparency problems, open code, explain how and where the data goes, how it's used, and engage with communities on changes, updates to the app. The app's development is funded into next fall, so there's lots of time to set up an improved oversight mechanism. So in closing, the development, design, launch, and implementation of ArriveCAN was rife with digital governance issues and errors. We can do better in future, but only if we understand, acknowledge, and accept the harm caused by ArriveCAN and the lack of defensible public health rationale to do so. Thank you. Happy to discuss any and all of this further.
Thank you, Ms. Wiley, and I appreciate you staying to time because that'll give us a lot more opportunity for questions. Mr. Malone, you have 5 minutes, sir. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Matt Malone. I'm an assistant professor at Thompson Rivers University Faculty of Law, and I'm attending the hearing today in a personal capacity representing only my own views. Je remercie le
I would like to thank the committee for this unexpected invitation and for giving me the opportunity to share my concerns regarding privacy and the ArriveCAN app. After my opening remarks, I would be pleased to respond to your questions.
I'd like to talk about how the government failed to take reasonable steps to ensure personal information collected and retained by the app was kept safe. Unquestionably, the worst example of this was the glitch that sent 10,200 people who correctly used the app faulty quarantine orders. The government's response to and transparency about the glitch were appalling. Some affected users were not notified that they were victims of the glitch for 12 days, and during those 12 days, the ArriveCAN privacy notice stated that disobeying a quarantine order issued by the app was punishable by a fine of up to $750,000 or 6 months in jail. When I wrote about this issue in the Globe and Mail in August, I received numerous harrowing stories from Canadians. This correspondence made very clear that many elderly and rural Canadians in particular were seriously affected. In my own experience, when I requested the personal information about me collected by CBSA through the app, it was not forthcoming from CBSA for 4 months. When I finally received it, there were many errors in my personal information. The foregoing suggests that the government failed to take reasonable steps to ensure the personal information it collected was both adequately safeguarded, as well as accurate, up-to-date, and complete as required by Section 6 of the Privacy Act. Second, I want to talk about secrecy. CBSA has not been forthcoming with Canadians or Parliament, including this committee. On November 14th, 2022, the CBSA president told the Government Operations and Estimates Committee that the CBSA spent 4% of its budget on ArriveCAN for security, but it has produced almost no records speaking to those efforts. The work of the primary contractors involved in building ArriveCAN also raises serious concerns. Based on my review of previous access to information requests, extensive correspondence between GC Strategy's managing partner Christian Firth and Chief Technology Officer of Canada Mark Bouillard shows that GC Strategies appears to operate more as an unregistered lobbyist than a primary contractor. As a primary contractor, it appears that the only real service they offer is secrecy, by subcontracting work through contracts that are shielded from disclosure as proprietary information. This is a deeply unsettling way to deliver government services that involve the mandatory collection and retention of Canadians' personal information. Third, I want to talk about the justification for the app. I have noted in my public and academic writings that the mandatory use of ArriveCAN did not meet the threshold under the Quarantine Act for emergency measures. Moreover, the government's rationale for the app kept changing. This became most obvious following the introduction of Advanced CBSA Declaration, an optional feature that was inserted into the mandatory architecture of the ArriveCAN app. When advanced CBSA declaration was unveiled, it was done so hastily that the government did not include a privacy notice as required under Section 5, subsection 2 of the Privacy Act. I believe this also likely implicated Sections 4 and 7 of the Privacy Act. Fourth, I want to talk about the government's disregard for existing oversight measures when it introduced ArriveCAN. With ArriveCAN, many of these measures were simply ignored entirely. Crucialement, le gouvernement a laissé de côté des
The government decided to remove many significant modalities, for example, the Privacy Act and the Directive on Automatic Decision-Making.
I believe that this episode underscores the need for urgent reform in the access to information system. We need robust access to information that sheds light on the work of quasi-lobbyists like GC Strategies. Using such entities to deliver services making decisions about Canadians which are neither subject to disclosure nor review is concerning in the context of mandatory collection and retention of Canadians' personal information. Ironically, GC Strategies itself once even pitched to the Treasury Board Secretariat using subcontractors to reform the access to information system's search function itself. The existing system needs more funding and more disclosure. Many of my own requests are egregiously delayed, and some have been simply ignored. I'm happy to discuss those. Finally, to echo the comments of my colleague Bianca Wiley, for whom I have great respect, I want to emphasize that the government should never have deviated from its own promises early in the pandemic that it would only introduce health apps on a voluntary basis. And this was echoed and supported by the statement, a joint statement of all privacy commissioners who came together to say the same. I believe public trust is essential in driving successful technology adoption, and I believe this kind of trust cannot be mandated. Je remercie le comité.
I would like to thank the committee again for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Malone. We're going to start with our questions. First round will be 6 minutes, and we'll start with Mr. Barrett. Mr. Barrett.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Ms. Wiley and Mr. Malone, for joining us here today. I'll start with you, if I can, Ms. Wiley. What does the risks that are that happen when security clearances are waived for some subcontractors who would be working on an app that deals with Canadians' biometric data, personal health data, their passport information? What are the risks to their personal privacy rights when something like that occurs?
They are numerous in terms of the fact that when you don't know how data can move and how it can evolve, if you lose control of it and you're allowing people to use it outside of the construct that people thought it was collected, you can have problems. One of the things that's important to know is data is so easily replicated and then adapted and moves that losing control over how it's managed, stored, used is a serious risk and creates significant liability. Should there be reasons to have exceptions to these rules, one would hope that those would be made clear and make sense, but the rules are there for a reason. So I think that's a question of process, is if there's an exception, why?
Right, and all of our public service employees already have the requisite clearances, and so keeping a program like this in-house and developing it over time would eliminate that particular risk. You talked about some of the examples about how data can move and how it can be later utilized. Could you give us a brief example of one of those risks?
Well, any kind of a data breach, what is difficult to do is to follow where the data goes and how it's then used. So that, I think, we're seeing how numerous they are. So really, you don't want to, this is why you want to minimize data collection in the first place, is because once things have a breach, it's very difficult to follow, continue, and understand. And you can't put it, this is one of those, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube situations.
Right. You talked about public trust. What does, by mandating the use of this technology, what is the impact that has on public trust?
Thanks for asking, because I think that was the most significant outcome here, was without confidence in how the government is using data, the public can't trust. And in this instance, the fact that this was mandated and there was for sure a lack of clarity from the government to the people as to how this data was being used, beyond the idea that we're in a pandemic or there's a crisis, therefore you must do X. So what happens when there's already issues with trust is this then accelerates the distrust. And this was so unnecessary because some people like this app. And if they like it and they feel comfortable using it and they can consent, perfect. If that's not someone, they need a great path to access the public service too. And that sort of failure to create that path, it just really inflamed distrust. And it was a very difficult point in time. So I think we can see it's a completely unnecessary loss of trust, and it happened. And as it was happening, it was shocking to me that I don't know how much people here saw, but the sort of concerns about how this data could or couldn't be used, because it wasn't clear, this sort of accelerated and was fomenting sort of distrust. It's the best word to use here. So the obvious antidote is you build alternatives for people. And the sort of just lack of investment to make sure people were comfortable. And to Matt's point earlier, if you want to get into good digital service delivery, you're going to get there by building trust and bringing people along with you. You don't force it. You open it up, you like the option, you use it, and then you continue along. So,
Right. Thanks very much. So I'll turn to you, Mr. Malone. I've got about 90 seconds left. With respect to the governance issues that you see with the execution, but also with the development of the app as well.
So the government has in place many policies and directives that should guide the development, construction, and deployment of an app like ArriveCan. What's boggling in this instance is that it essentially threw out all of these well-developed policies, threw them out the window. For example, the Directive on Automated Decision-Making states that there should be an algorithmic impact assessment done at the time that an app is, at the time artificial intelligence will be deployed, when that is constructed, at the outset of the program that will do that. And that never occurred. The only algorithmic impact assessment, to my knowledge, that is available is one that was done a year and a half after the fact that ArriveCan was introduced. This assessment, the policy, the directive says that the assessment should also occur whenever the app is significantly updated, and that occurred at many instances. But rather than adhering to the government's own policies, it simply unveiled the developments in the App Store, and that's what got the government into trouble when it introduced advanced CBSA declaration into the iOS version of the app, because it was an update in June that caused the glitch.
And to be clear, with respect to the assessment of potential impacts, you're talking about the potential impacts that it would have on the user, like mandatory, quarantine, effectively house arrest, with facing possible jail time or substantial monetary fines. That's the type of impact?
No, not precisely.
Very short answer, please, Mr. Malone.
The directive has risk mitigation items, and they're slightly different from that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Next, we'll go for 6 minutes to Mr. Fergus. Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank both of our witnesses. I was very interested, Ms. Wiley, by your opening remarks. I would like to ask you a few questions based on your comments today and based on other things. You mentioned having concerns with regards to the protection of data. Did you know that the Public Health Agency of Canada sent to the Privacy Commissioner, requested, rather, that an assessment be done with ArriveCan and the use of data? Were you aware of that?
Madame Wiley,
Miss Wiley, did you know that the same commissioner had conducted an assessment of ArriveCan and found no significant concerns.
I know what the Privacy Commissioner shared back. However, the reason that we both raised the Privacy Commissioners, all of their concern with the app being mandatory rather than voluntary, that came from the Privacy Commissioner because there's no one else in the government that even has a mandate to look at the application of the technology, which in this situation, when we're talking about trust and people's concerns, we need to break out of the privacy paradigm and into the question of appropriate use and ethics.
Est-ce que ça, c'est plutôt une décision
Is it more of a political decision? In order to ensure Canadians' privacy while dealing with a threat to our public health?
To me, this is not a political topic at all. We can bring in two facets of the existing government. Open government. What was the public health impact of ArriveCan? This has not been communicated clearly to the public. And in terms of decision-making about the use of technology, I'd like to share with everyone here, there is major cultural deference to the Public Health Agency of Canada, which makes a lot of sense in a pandemic. But deference to the Public Health Agency of Canada on the use of technology does not make any sense. This is not something where the implications of applying technology and all of its related infrastructures that are upstream of both PHAC and CBSA, these are totally different issues that don't sit just neatly in the realm of privacy. And so this second piece here is important as well, that we understand why did the Public Health Agency of Canada, nothing in the Quarantine Act said that we had to have an app, nor a mandatory app. Why did they have the authority to exert that decision when it was against what all of the privacy commissioners recommended for public trust? If there was a good reason, back to open government, it should have been communicated, but it wasn't.
Vous avez dit,
Ms. Wiley, you stated in your opening remarks that no public service should be delivered through apps. Does this go against the modern world? People are increasingly looking to have services that are easy to use and at hand. There was an online service that was created to help people receive their benefits during the pandemic, to receive the CERB, and it helped people who lost their jobs. That seems to be the way the world is going, to have services that are easy to understand and easier to use, all while respecting their privacy.
We need to make a distinction here between the internet and web, and you can have technology that is designed for the internet and for mobile devices that is not apps that are available through the App Store. Because when Google and Apple and their iOS systems become implicated in the delivery of our public services And we're not in charge of how Google and Apple develop their mobile operating systems. We are creating a dependency in our technical infrastructure that is a major liability. So we can have modern technology. It doesn't have to live in the apps.
Mr. Fergus, I'm sorry, but like we're 45 seconds over here. So if you want to pick that up later, I would encourage you to do that. Prochaine, on a,
Next question, Mr. Villemur, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Malone, you worked for many organizations in the technology sector? No? Inaudible. And your field of practice in law was? I worked for clients in the technology sector. In your opening remarks, you said that no reasonable measures were taken to protect privacy data.
The ultimate recommendation that this would come down to, if we were in an alternative world, would simply be to follow the government's own recommendations and the directives that it has in place, like the directive on automated decision-making. So, for example, that directive encourages source code in applications to be rendered public by default. In this case, that did not happen, distinct from other apps, other health apps designed to prevent the transmission of COVID-19. And additionally, that directive also sets out that there should be meaningful explanations of how the artificial intelligence that such an app might be using is actually being used to make decisions affecting Canadians. In this case, it's very difficult to get those explanations. We never got them. And a large part of that was because the subcontracts from the primary contractors that the CBSA and PHAC used were essentially trade secrets and confidential information. And before the Government Operations and Estimate Committee on November 14th, a representative from PSPC said very clearly that this information is information that is treated as proprietary, which to me was very concerning.
Selon vous, c'était pas de l'information confidentielle.
Inaudible.
Transparency and accountability as intended in the Access to Information Act. The manual for that act says very clearly that underlying contracts with businesses that are doing business with the Government of Canada, those contracts should be open by default. There should be no presumption of confidentiality. So I don't understand why the presumption of confidentiality exists when it's only a subcontract. I think that all of those subcontracts should be rendered public. I think it's in the public interest to know them, all the more so because of the fact that the largest of the contracts was granted in a non-competitive bid.
excuse me, Mr. Villemur.
Apologies, Mr. Villemur. I'm going to stop the time, but twice now, interpreters have not been able to hear the question. If you can, please speak more slowly, perhaps. I'll restart your time. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Please continue.
Well, essentially, I think the problem is that subcontracts should be rendered open by default.
Vous avez parlé de GC strategy.
You talked about GC strategies earlier and subcontractors. Do you believe that having all those people could have an influence on public policies?
I'm not sure that I would have enough knowledge to answer that question, quite honestly.
OK.
No.
Merci beaucoup, madame.
Thank you. Miss Wiley, you talked a lot about trust and the risks of damaging trust. You talked about the Privacy Commissioner, and they shared a response that you know. Are you satisfied with that response?
No,
Pourquoi?
Why not?
it's not enough. Once we look at our technology in the frame of privacy, we're downstream from questions such as, should this exist? Should we build it? Should we buy it? If we buy it, how are we going to build it? How are we going to maintain it? How are we going to sunset it? There are numerous issues that happen upstream of what the commissioner has a mandate to oversee. So there's a lot that doesn't land there, and that to me is an ongoing concern.
Est-ce que vous diriez que
Would you say that the commissioner examined the how that ArriveCan was made instead of the why we needed ArriveCan?
Once they made their statement in 2020, we saw the advice, don't make it mandatory, make it voluntary. From that point forward, it appeared as though they were supporting the implementation, and I didn't see much resistance.
OK. Et pour rétablir.
And in order to reestablish trust, and I agree with you that it was damaged, what can be done as of now?
With ArriveCan specifically, the setting up a public oversight body, which we had, you could almost immediately replicate what was done for the COVID Alert app, where you bring in a group of people, you have meetings, they can help communicate issues back to government, you can have an audit of the app, open the code. There's numerous things that we could replicate from the lessons of COVID Alert. So that's an easy one. And I think the other thing that we need to do is be clear about what the pandemic impact was of ArriveCan, because somehow we just keep having this, it's an emergency, we have to do it. However, what was the public health rationale and what was the outcome of ArriveCan on the pandemic?
Because with ArriveCan, nothing was learned. What will it take for the government to learn from its mistakes?
I have no idea, because this keeps happening over and over again. And what I want to make clear, modernizing by just thinking, let's accelerate, let's modernize, let's be somehow in the future, this notion, this has infected the public service and the culture of senior management. And I need to disclose that I saw people celebrating the number of downloads of this app in the middle of a public health crisis in comparison with apps that have nothing to do with public service. So the incentives inside the government need to be explored because there are problems there within the public service.
Assurément remplacer le réflexe par la réflexion.
The interpreter regrets, but again, she missed the beginning of the question because the mics are bugging.
Monsieur Villemur, posez la question encore.
Please repeat your question. We're having problems with microphones. I asked if we should change our way of doing things and focus on reflecting more.
So change our way. If we want to look at how we want to modernize the government and the use of technology, I understand we want efficiencies. We cannot put efficiency over the experience of people who are receiving services from the government of Canada. Sometimes people will need an inefficient approach, and what we have to figure out here is the balance. But we cannot go all in on tech. We have to make sure we're building redundancies. Do people remember when we had the internet outage? The app wasn't working at the airport for a day in Pearson, and of course we had redundancy. The public service has to be built on redundancy. It can't just be all one way. But we can do great technology, we can build it, but we have to be intentional about how, and that we support every single person who needs to access the public service in an equitable way.
Okay, thank you. Merci, Monsieur Villemur.
Thank you, Mr. Villemur.
Floor for probably a little more than 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to take my 6. I want to welcome the guests. This is a very important investigation into, hopefully some of the ways we can improve upon privacy and the use of technology. I want to allow Ms. Wiley to expand on 2 notions to begin with. The first is this culture that she commented on, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering through you if Ms. Wiley could expand on some of her observations, in her opinion, in her own words, how she feels the bureaucratic culture might be counterintuitive to be able to provide good and effective digital products to people that respect civil liberties and privacy.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to expand on this. As I understand, within the public service at senior levels, if someone receives some political enthusiasm for an app or for a technology, for something that's going to be innovative or modern, there is very little space to push back and to say, you know what, this approach might not make sense, or where is this coming from, or which firm, which person has an interest. I need to return to the App Store for a moment, because if if we need to understand anything at this point in time in 2022, companies like Google and Apple want to be living in the infrastructure that we use in our public services across the board. They have no subject matter expertise to be involved in public health or border services. So the point here is, if we don't begin to understand the need to both develop good future-oriented technology in the public service, there has to be room for senior management to say, I hear what you want to do with technology, but this is actually a bad idea. Here are the reasons why. Yes.
You've picked up on an important point. I'm getting feedbacks, Mr. Chair. How is it now? Is it okay? I think somebody in the room might have a mic on close or something.
Yeah, I think Miss Wiley had her mic on with the earpiece. Maybe that had something to do with it. I don't know, but
Okay.
Is that better, Matt?
It is much better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So my apologies. I just wanted to reflect on this notion that we have perhaps a culture which would reward kind of corporate capitalist metrics, i.e. you reference downloads, versus the user experience and applicability for public use and public consumption, and ultimately for the public benefit. Is that a fair comment that perhaps we've adopted too much of this kind of corporatization of public services in order to advance internally some careers and some pet projects? Is that?
Definitely.
And so, you talked about the inequalities, the inequities that making a mandatory public service digital creates. Can you describe what some of those inequities might be?
Well, first of all, we know not everybody has access to whether it's mobile devices or computers, but far more important than that piece of it, which is known, is the digital literacy to use these things in a way that protect ourselves. And there's an inequity there because, interesting point about ArriveCan, whether people are handing you information on a form or through an app, it's all heading up into an infrastructure that none of us know what it is. We don't know what's going on. And if we can't start to explain that to each other, and this is why open government matters, you're not going to get the buy-in from people to use these things.
Can you define, I'm not trying to be reductionist here, but can you define open government? Because part of the challenge that I have is I feel like we get into these bureaucratic spaces, we use buzzwords all the time. We had a government who said they were going to be open by default. They were going to be the most transparent government, and they were going to provide open government. Can you just define what that might look like briefly?
Yeah, to me, so there's open data, there's open science, and there is open information. I believe these are the three circles of how this space is defined. But what's really important about open government, and I bring you this from being a facilitator running public meetings, people may not like the decisions you make, but if you explain what you're doing, you can get to a good place from a democratic perspective. And so to bring this all the way back to your question in terms of what the inequities look like, it's not just do I have a phone or not, or am I comfortable or not. This second piece of am I comfortable or not, people were contacting me, much like Matt mentioned, they were scared. They didn't want to travel. They didn't know what they just did. They used an app. They weren't even sure what just happened. That doesn't get measured in any metrics, right? Like that metric doesn't exist. And the people, so you have these missing pieces of information about how this impacted people. We have, between me and Matt.
I'm not sure how much time I have. I'm not sure how much time I have left, so please forgive me.
About 30 seconds, Matt.
There's a really important piece that you can answer in a very short way, and this does ultimately come down to, in your opinion, should ArriveCan be audited by the Privacy Commissioner?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Green. On va commencer avec le...
We're going to move on to our second round. Mr. Gould, you have 5 minutes for your questions followed by Ms. Hepfner. Mr. Gould. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. My first question is going to be for both witnesses. Do you have any examples of Canadians that were negatively impacted by the ArriveCan app?
My inbox flooded with stories after I wrote my Globe and Mail piece on August 8th. There was an individual in Montreal who I spoke with on the phone who was quite distraught about his experience trying to get to Vermont for family and for health reasons. There was an individual in rural Saskatchewan who contacted me who said that he and his wife did not own a cell phone and that he was reaching out to me from a public library where he had been trying to print his ArriveCan. Yeah. And I can imagine Bianca has stories as well.
Yeah, many. There's an op-ed written by a Canadian in a publication called Rabble, and it, beyond getting the glitch notification, they had a hard time getting an answer from the government about whether there was a glitch or not. So they were just told on the phone, no, it's just a glitch, but we're unable to get anything in writing or any confirmation. So I think if we look at the thousands of people that were impacted just on the glitch level, and then the other thousands of people, probably more than that, who were scared to travel or had an uncomfortable experience. I mean, we're into very large numbers here about negative consequences for people using this app.
Advenant.
If there were to be a class action against ArriveCan, and because of the way contracts were given to create ArriveCan, there were a lot of subcontractors. Who would be responsible for the mess? Mr. Malone, to start?
I would say that the committee itself has responsibility over certain aspects of the story here, and I would turn it a little bit to you. So, for example, GC Strategies operates essentially as a quasi-lobbyist, and I've put in access to information requests to obtain records of the correspondence and communication that those figures had with figures within TBS and other sectors that were responsible for contracting. It's not clear to me entirely why they were not registered as lobbyists when that is essentially the work that they were doing. In addition to that piece, I would say that the access to information aspect of this story is incredibly important. I have outstanding access to information requests that would be directly relevant to the inquiry that, or the questions that the committee is exploring right now. So, for example, in July, I put in a request for assessments of privacy, cybersecurity, and data breach risks of the ArriveCan app, including but not limited to studies, reviews, explanations, audits, manuals, bug reports, validation studies, and others concerning the security of the app that the CBSA conducted or that third parties conducted for the CBSA. And the CBSA responded by giving me a 90-day extension, which has subsequently elapsed, and they have simply not responded to my request, which is a violation of the Access to Information Act. That seems directly relevant to the scope of the work of this particular meeting.
Have much to add in terms of the responsibility here. I think I need to, I would consider what precedent is. If there, I think at the end of the day, this lands with the government as a whole, and I'd have to understand in any other case when there was a digital product, who was at the end of the line from a liability perspective.
Ce qu'on a entendu, c'est que là...
We heard that the costs for ArriveCan were about $54 million. Is it possible that the contractors and subcontractors had a lot of wiggle room in case they were to be sued, and that's why the app was created quite quickly? And a lot of specialists said that it was not very complicated for something that was so expensive.
So when a product is developed, there's a stage called requirements writing and gathering, right? And it, like, in terms of the time it would take to work between the government and the contractors, that's a That's so different than someone saying, oh, this should be fast because I handed you what to build, right? So I think there is a relevant process time in that number. So in terms of the rationale for the cost, without seeing how this went down, I couldn't speak to it. But I want us to remember that what we don't get when we fail to invest in the public service is reuse. If we're spending this much money, we should be investing into the capacity and code with conditions that we can reuse as the federal government. So this, to me, bad spending decision regardless.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Wiley. Next, we have Ms. Hepner for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I would like to start off my questions with, through you to Mr. Malone. I heard you talk about breaches to the app, but then you went on to describe faulty quarantine notices that went out. So it wasn't that it was a breach of data or personal information. It was 10,000 false quarantines that went out to people, which is about 0.03% of the 30 million times that it was used. So I'm wondering if you have any evidence of data breaches or personal information being leaked from this app.
So there is one processed access to information request, which I believe dates from the summer of 2021, which is viewable.
So you've got a request out, but you have no information at this point?
No. There's one request which is not mine, which is already processed, which confirmed that as of summer of 2021, there had been no breaches. And then I put in a request for confirmation from the CBSA's media unit in early September, and they also confirmed that there were no data breaches. So that's separate from my outstanding request to know more about the studies that were done to prevent data breaches. So far, I've heard that there have been no breaches of the app as of September 1st, 2022. And that is separate from the glitch that sent those erroneous quarantine orders.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And Ms. Wiley, I was listening to you talk about how ArriveCan is sort of closed code, and you've been advocating that it be open code, that people can understand it better. To quote Mr. Barrett, at the OGO study that revolved around these same sorts of things, the app contains biometric, personal, and health information of more than 8 million people who downloaded the app. And Mr. Barrett was concerned about hypothetical bad actors who could build in a backdoor access to this information in the future. He said there's a lot of ways that foreign state actors can test our systems and our processes. This looks like a great opportunity for them to do that. So do you agree, based on this sensitive information, that this app should have been developed with the highest degree of sensitivity and the most constraints around our personal information?
Making the code base for the app closed doesn't create the security that I think you're suggesting. So, of course, it should be well developed, but it could be well developed and with an eye to what is being collected and used, but still be open source code. The mechanics, the underlying code, the architecture, how it works. There's no reason, there's no problem with that being open and also with it serving the purpose that it served.
Okay, so you don't see any privacy concerns with that. So this study focuses specifically on the costs associated with ArriveCan and the handling of personal information. And you've talked about how there should have been from the beginning redundancies so that people didn't have to use the app. But I'm wondering if you took into account how much it would have cost to have all those redundancies put in from the beginning.
Yeah, I definitely did, and I don't think you can put a price on trust. I think the damage that this app did to public trust, it would have been worth, you could have tripled what was spent on ArriveCan to make sure that kiosks were updated or that we were staffed.
You did crunch the numbers? You do?
No, what I'm saying is, no problem. But however much it would cost to not have lost this trust would have been a worthwhile investment.
So, and you don't know of any breaches of personal data or privacy that came from using the app?
I do not know of any, no.
In your experience as a what do I have down in your expertise, what challenges would exist to ensure the integrity and safety of the data that people provide to a company, or in this case, the government?
Yeah, the best principle is always data minimization, and this is why I keep repeating. What was the public health rationale for ArriveCan to be developed as an app? I don't understand what the public health rationale was for this app.
So that wasn't my question. I wondered if you could explain to us from your expertise, how do you ensure the integrity and safety of the data that people
So the first piece
provide?
of this, sorry, it's not clear. I didn't make it clear enough connection. You minimize, as a first step, is data minimization. So you don't collect it if you don't need it. And so this becomes the question here in terms of what was collected and how was it used by the Public Health Agency of Canada. I don't know. But if it was necessary to have that information, then you get into all your sort of basics in terms of storage, who has access, which we have, as Matt has mentioned. Like, we have good policy for how to design secure architecture. So I don't, I'm going to keep going back to the first point, which is you don't want to hold data unless you really have to.
Okay, thank you. I think my
thank-
time's up.
Thank you, Ms. Wiley. Monsieur Villemure, 2 minutes et demi.
Monsieur Villemure, 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Wiley, do you believe that the average person understands the issues related to the use of an app like ArriveCan?
Absolutely not.
Est-ce qu'il y a
Would it be a good idea to have or to promote digital literacy? Because a lot of this can be hard to understand.
Absolutely. And when I say absolutely not, that includes myself, because I don't even know where this information is going once it moves back into government infrastructure and architecture. And I just want to say, this government had people uploading their passport information on airport Wi-Fi. Okay? It's not just what the app is and what the code is. It's what are the habits and what are the use protocols that you're encouraging people to follow when you develop and implement an application such as this. So if this government is following these approaches and then also being in charge of digital literacy, I would still be concerned.
C'est inquiétant, en effet.
It is concerning, indeed, and it leads to everything but trust. Earlier you stated that modernization and transformation is seen as trivial, but it is in fact anything but. Could you elaborate, please? In about 1 minute.
What I'd like people in this room to know is that modernizing government is still fairly novel. There's a lot of excitement about things that are novel. We have not reckoned with the consequences about redress, how we have access to justice when things go wrong with digital public service delivery. So a lot of people seem to get caught up in this enthusiasm for modernization, but we still have a whole bunch of stuff we haven't even reckoned with in terms of issues and access to justice. So I would just really like us to think about reducing the inherent enthusiasm for putting technology on top of and through everything in ways that are not thoughtful.
Merci. Monsieur Malone,
Thank you. Mr. Malone, in a couple seconds, do you believe that the average person understands?
Can feel concern around it, and I think that's what's palpable in the public discourse.
est-ce qu'il pourrait contribuer?
Could that contribute to the erosion of trust?
I think the fact that the app delivered erroneous orders to people who correctly used it is detrimental to building trust.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Villemure.
2 minutes, please.
Professor Malone, do you also agree that we should have an audit of the ArriveCan through the Privacy Commissioner?
Yes, the Privacy Commissioner, to my understanding, currently has at least 2 complaints before it regarding ArriveCan. One of them is my complaint. The Privacy Commissioner has also stated quite clearly that there are no data sharing agreements in place for how the data is being transmitted by the third parties that are hidden behind the subcontractors that are hidden behind those contracts. So I believe
Professor Malone, what's the impact of that?
What's the impact of not having data sharing agreements in place? It doesn't govern
Correct.
how the data will be used, and it essentially obviates the consent that users would be able to give to how their data would be used, which I think is a very important provision within the Privacy Act itself. So not only do we have problems here with whether or not the data was being kept accurately, in a manner that was complete, in a manner that was up to date, and when I requested my own data and saw my data and I saw how the algorithms were interpreting my passport and reading my name and spelling my name and scrambling my phone number incorrectly, it was very clear to me that this app was shoddily constructed. And so not only do we have a problem with the accuracy of the data, but in terms of how the data is being shared by these entities whose names are all we know about them, that's a big problem when it comes to informed consent as required in the Privacy Act.
And carrying on from that, in Lessons from ArriveCAN, Access to Information and Justice During a Glitch, you wrote that the government failed to place the data collected from ArriveCAN into a personal information bank despite the requirements of the Privacy Act. Can you describe what were the potential consequences of this failure?
So I essentially asked the CBSA's media arm for information about whether or not, what personal information bank, as required in the Privacy Act, they had been placed into, and the CBSA media arm refused to provide any answer whatsoever, which led me to believe that they simply had not done it. And so this data, which had been collected and retained for a minimum of 2 years with no expiry, as the privacy notice for ArriveCAN itself stated, who knew where it was going, and who knows where it is now?
Lastly, I just want to ask both members who are present here today if they would consider providing in written remarks any recommendations that they might have as it relates to changes that should be made in the Privacy Act to perhaps prevent this from happening again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Take that as a request from Mr. Green for both our witnesses. We've got Mr. Barrett for 2.5 minutes, followed by Ms. Khalid, and that'll be the end of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. So I just want to be really clear. This is an app that erroneously caused 10,000 people to have their civil liberties suspended, ordered under house arrest, and a breach of that order was warned against with threat of jail time or fine. And so that there's been a characterization that this is a small number in the context of the total number of users of the app is offensive. This is 10,000 people who followed all of the rules. They broke no laws and were ordered not to leave their homes, or they would be put in jail. And they were ordered by an app that they downloaded in the App Store, and that's there was no way for them to redress that grievance. There was nothing for them to do. And when they called my office, they called many other folks, and we tried to intervene for them. It was about day 16 or day 17 of their 14-day quarantine before they were actually able to have demonstration that they were in fact still free. So it's so important that we do highlight that. Mr. Malone, you've mentioned GC Strategies a couple of times. This is a company that has 2 employees. It took in $9 million. It did no tech work on this app that is entirely technological in nature, handling sensitive data. To be clear, this 2-person company, when they did appear at a parliamentary committee, couldn't even say which of the 2 of them answered the telephone when the government called to award them a $9 million contract that they wouldn't have to do any tech work on. So we don't know who their subcontractors are. So there is a lack of transparency. I've used a lot of time here. You talked about skirting access to information laws and potentially lobbying rules. Are you able to expand on that a bit with the remaining time?
Existing access to information request I referenced, which is 2018-00247, GC Strategies had very regular contact with the Chief Technology Officer of Canada. There's a reference in an email that they typically touch base once a quarter, and I can produce the records for the committee, which are essentially just pitches that they would pose as an intermediary company where a third-party technology company would provide services. So, for example, reforming the access to information's search function on the Open Canada website, they pitched a project to the Chief Technology Officer to do that. So as a starting point, I would like to get the correspondence and sort of the calendar meetings between those individuals. I think that's really important. There is a registration function for lobbyists, which I think probably should be the case for entities like this. And within the access to information system sort of manual itself, I think there should be clearly enunciated rules that subcontracts in these types of situations should be open.
Thank you, Mr. Malone.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
During Mr. Malone's response, he offered documents. Is that something that we can have the clerk collect on at the end of the meeting?
We can certainly have the clerk follow up with Mr. Malone on that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Baird. Ms. Khalid, you have 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate it. I'll start with Ms. Wiley. Ms. Wiley, have you used the ArriveCAN app before? No. Mr. Malone, have you used the app?
Yes, about 5 to 10 times.
Thank you. Ms. Wiley, in your opening remarks, you had given a couple of recommendations. You had said that digital must be complemented with non-digital, and that public service should not be delivered through apps or web-based applications. Now, we, as the government, when it came to protecting the personal health data of Canadians, do you think that having electronic apps that processed 30 million submissions would be safer than having paper-based records? What are measures that you think would be more protective of paper-based as opposed to digital?
So the digital, and this is good to get to complete a thought from earlier, web-based application, so being able to use the internet to go, as ArriveCAN had 3 options, right? You could use it on your computer, just log in with an email, or you could use it through Apple or Google operating systems, right? This version where you work through the web is the one that is the most open. It is the one where the protocols are the most accessible to everybody, and where, from a technical design perspective, we have a better shot at doing digital without the constraints imposed upon us by Google and Apple through the app stores. So I'm not saying that there should be no digital. What I'm saying is that the web application, mobile design that's responsive to web is an option for sure. Because to your point, yes, there may be improvements in the fidelity of the data collection or whatever else through using these things. But no matter what we do, we can always improve our public services as well to make sure that how we improve accuracy for things we receive on forms or or kiosk or whatever else, those are improvements we need to make concurrently. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Khalid. I want to thank both our witnesses for being here today, Mr. Malone and Ms. Wiley. I think you provided the committee with some valuable information. I will remind committee members that we are going to come back to resume on the access to information study. I'm going to suspend for a few minutes, but before I do, just keep in mind that the microphones sometimes take a little bit of a delay of a couple of seconds, so when we're asking questions, be mindful of that because it'll help the interpreters. Mr. Malone, Ms. Wiley, thank you again on behalf of Canadians for being here today. The meeting is suspended until we get set up for the next meeting. Thank you. 0838, motion adopted by the committee on Monday, May 16th, 2022. The committee is resuming its study of access to information and privacy system. Madam Clerk, just to confirm that all of the witnesses have been tested from a hearing and speaking standpoint?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to now call our witnesses for this afternoon. First of all, as an individual, Mary Francoli, who is the Associate Dean and Director of the Arthur Kroger College of Public Affairs, and as an individual, Mr. Patrick White. Again, this is about access to information. Ms. Francoli, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes to address the committee. Thank you.
So much for having me. I wanted to start today by saying that my own work is on transparency and open government more broadly, and access to information is certainly an important cornerstone, but transparency itself is more extensive. And I think that'll be useful because the motion that passed initiating your study refers to the Access to Information and Privacy System and not specifically to the Access to Information Act, which to me is a little bit more specific. I don't want to repeat any of the points made by previous witnesses regarding the Access to Information Act itself. This has to be one of the most widely studied pieces of legislation there is, and I think there's been, obviously not unanimous, but a great deal of agreement on the problems surrounding the Act and what could be done to improve them. I'm happy to speak to that during questions, though, and I'll reinforce many of the points that you've already heard. So I thought I'd use my opening remarks to draw on my experience as the chair of the Open Government Partnerships International Expert Panel and my experience over the last 3 years with the National Security Transparency Advisory Group, or the NSTAG, as we've come to be known. And I'll start by saying there's no clear or very coordinated transparency strategy in Canada, but I think this committee should note that there are a lot of activities. In many cases, they're actually quite siloed, that are taking place that are meant to improve the quality and the quantity of information and data disclosure, and to improve transparency and accountability in government. And if done well, these things should theoretically help to ease pressure on the ATIP system itself. Canada has submitted 5 action plans to the Open Government Partnership, which include a range of commitments to improve openness. Some of the 2015 improvements to access to information mentioned by previous witnesses here were the result of commitments included in our early plans to the Open Government Partnership. The plans engage a wide range of governments and departments and agencies, and they've helped to release information and data via the creation of mechanisms like the Open Science and Data Platform. Library and Archives has done a lot of interesting transparency work in spite of the fact that it's been heavily criticized for compliance with the Access to Information Act. The government has elaborated a national security transparency commitment. The NSTAG has had a role in helping to advance this. We've released 3 reports to date. The first just kind of simply said what we heard in our first year. The second looked at building transparency into national security institutions. And the third looks at how national security institutions engaged with racialized communities. From what I understand, the government's also working on an open government strategy for the OECD. So for me, a full study of the Access to Information Privacy System, again, stressing that word system, needs to go well beyond the Act itself, and it needs to include these other activities, and it needs to include offices beyond just the Information and Privacy Commissioner. And just to wrap up, I'll say my recommendations would be to have a Government of Canada transparency strategy that brings these sorts of dispersed initiatives together. The strategy, the structure around the strategy, including things like access to information, library and archives, systems of information management, all need to be included. That includes looking at things like storage and retrieval, the need for all of these things to be resourced properly. In just a couple more sentences, because I'm probably at the end of my time, emphasis should be put on proactive disclosure and open by default where appropriate. And one of the things that the NSTAG has recommended to the national security community is the development of a statement committing to transparency what it means to the different security institutions, and how it will be measured. This could be helpful across government. Transparency is something that really needs to be baked into the function and culture of government in a way that it currently isn't, and including times of crisis. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Francoli. Under time, which is always appreciated by the committee. Patrick White, as an individual, is next. Sir, you have 5 minutes to address the committee.
Monsieur Président,
Mr. Chair, members of the committee.
thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the committee's study on the Access to Information and Privacy, or ATIP regime. I'm here in my capacity as a citizen of Canada. Before I begin my remarks, I would like to acknowledge that I make this presentation before the committee today despite fully expecting reprisals or attempts at reprisals from the Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of National Defence. There is a group of individuals who have been ignored and forgotten during discussions on the ATIP regime, victims and survivors of the abuse of power and sexual misconduct crisis in the Canadian Armed Forces. My evidence today will focus on the interactions of such individuals with the ATIP regime. To properly understand how problematic the current ATIP regime is, Parliament must understand the most vulnerable types of CAF members who rely on it for access to essential information and records needed to make informed decisions about their legal rights and file fulsome and well-supported complaints. These individuals could be victims of rape or aggravated sexual assault. They could be victims of threats and abuses from reprisals perpetrated by the chain of command. They could be members wrongfully denied employment opportunities or reimbursement for expenses. They could be the 16-year-old who cannot legally drink, smoke, or vote, but who received parental consent to join the CAF while completing high school. Or they could be any combination of the above. Briefly, I offer some of my credentials and experience. I'm a graduate of the Ivy School of Business Honors and Business Administration program and the McGill University Juris Doctor Bachelor of Civil Law program. An attorney licensed by the Law Society of Ontario with experience working in corporate law firms in Canada and the United States. I have served Canada for over 13 years as a naval warfare officer in the Naval Reserve, during which I gained direct familiarity with the ATIP regime. And finally, when it comes to being subjected to sexual misconduct and abuse of power reprisals in the Canadian Armed Forces, I will simply say, me too. As to the reforms of the system and to assist victims and survivors, I recommend the committee consider the following. Conduct a standalone study on the abuses of the Access to Information and Privacy regime by the Department of National Defence and Canadian Armed Forces. Create real penalties for departments which breach ATIP requirements and provide real remedies for victims, survivors, and complainants. Consider creating a fast-track system under the ATIP regime for identified victims and survivors of misconduct. Require certain essential pieces of information to be mandatorily disclosed to victims or complainants unless explicitly waived with written informed consent. Require mandatory disclosure of the names of all record holders who actively handle or are involved in the decision-making process behind a decision generated by a complaint. Pause the time limit to submit complaints such as grievances if an information request has been made and disclosure of such information would be relevant in drafting the complaint. Ensure that records are retained post-retirement with clear administrative and disciplinary sanctions for those who violate such directive and seek to use retirement to abscond from accountability. Investigate and implement options of eliminating the honor system approach to record disclosure. Create specific administrative and disciplinary sanctions for those who avoid creating records or who prematurely destroy records. Identify at the intake stage requests for records which the chain of command may resist and require extra scrutiny in disclosure of such records. And finally, require mandatory disclosure of search terms used by individual record holders in response to information requests. Merci pour votre attention.
Thank you for your attention.
Mr. White, for your statement. I'm going to move to the first round of questionings. We're going to start with Mr. Barrett for 6 minutes. For the members of the committee, I allowed a little extra time on some of the questions in the earlier panel. I'm going to stick to the timelines tight because we do have committee business that we have to take care of afterwards. Mr. Barrett, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Francoli, and thank you, Mr. White, for joining us. Mr. White, I want to thank you for your service to our country and the Canadian Forces. I'm wondering if you could provide the committee with some examples of the difficulties that victims and survivors face in navigating the ATIP system.
Thank you for the question. Some examples that I've personally faced, and I know others have as well, is the amount of information required upfront before a request can be processed. As an example, if you're filing an access to information request about records related to a person's misconduct or about an individual who may have assaulted you or harmed you, you're required to provide their service number. The service number is a protected piece of information. So to ask a potentially victimized junior member who might not have access to that information to provide it, it's an immediate barrier. And for them to go to their chain of command and request that information may possibly allow them to be identified as a potential record requester when the process is designed to allow them to remain anonymous.
The grievance system is the main dispute resolution process for the Canadian Armed Forces members. How does the ATIP system interact with the grievance system?
The problem is it doesn't effectively, not from my experience. The timeline that a member has to file a grievance begins with a 90-day limit from when a decision or an action is taken or made, or that the member should reasonably ought to have known be made. As I frequently have experienced, the department is extremely tight on timelines when it's applied to victims, but of course, not so tight when it comes to actually responding and meeting their own timelines imposed under legislation. The circumstances, however, are such that a victim may need information before they make a request. And in fact, they may decide not to file a grievance at all if certain information is disclosed relating to a decision, or if certain information is provided relating to their personal records. Under no circumstances have I experienced that a formal pause on the time limit is imposed when someone is looking to file a grievance. Now, yes, commanders and those who receive the grievances do have the ability to pause and consider grievances beyond that 90-day limit, but it's entirely discretionary. And so right away, I'm sure when you hear the word discretionary, you're thinking potential for abuse. And rest assured, there are circumstances that exist that would make that a reality.
The problem that you've outlined. Is this just a Directorate of Access to Information and Privacy within the Department of National Defense? Is that where it stops?
I wouldn't say so. My experience is I have obviously appreciative of the patience and understanding of the officials who work in the Directorate of Access to Information and Privacy within the Department of National Defense. But the process then becomes that record requests are then sent to the individual parts of the forces or the Department of National Defense. So what that means is the central nervous system of DAPE, for example, is relying on those record holders to provide that information. And it's almost entirely based on an honor system. For example, if emails were requested, that one of which might incriminate someone or provide context and background that indicates impropriety or in a decision, you go to that individual and say, please provide all records responsive to this request. Well, I don't know that they have that email, and they may turn over 99 others and delete that one email that leads to some degree of culpability or embarrassment or something that is, as may be the case. You have to get lucky that someone perhaps is not fully paying attention, or it's not them who might be liable, and so they just disclose everything. But there are significant roadblocks in place to ensuring that a fulsome and honest disclosure of these records occurs. As another example, members, when they receive requests for information, are told to provide the search terms they use. So you go to Microsoft Outlook, perhaps, and you type in the search terms related to it. But those search terms aren't necessarily disclosed unless you file a subsequent request. So I have an entire list, of course, of examples where it's just, I have incredible amounts of empathy for those who have experienced things far beyond even what I have, and maybe so traumatized that little simple things that come back at them rather than full support and fulsome disclosure just is a barrier they can't overcome.
I've got less than 30 seconds left. I appreciate your answers to my questions. I am very curious on your recommendation for a standalone study of the ATIP regime within the Department of National Defence and Canadian Armed Forces, and if that's not something you're able to discuss or elaborate on in your replies to other members, I would just encourage you to file that with the clerk of the committee in writing at your earliest opportunity, so that it might be considered in the evidence that we use for our report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Ms. Sachs, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. White, I would be remiss if I didn't start in just acknowledging the courage it takes to come forward to a committee. First of all, thank you for your service. But sexual abuse is abhorrent. We have an absolute responsibility to victims to make sure that the process by which they go through in bringing their trauma forward is done with compassion and with a sense of transparency and also a sense of safety. I think it's important to acknowledge, and I speak on behalf of myself, but also all the colleagues in this room in our absolute support in making sure that that safety and transparency is there. You bring a very sensitive process to light in the context of a study about the access to information, and I'm wondering if you could maybe walk us through the process by which a victim would consider going through the ATIP route to be able to access documentation, because there are mechanisms in place within CAF. We have a Minister of Defence who has made it her absolute mission and commitment to make sure that victims are protected through this process. But since we do have you here today, respectfully, I'd ask if you could share with us how that works currently.
I thank you for the question, and it is a very on-point question. My challenge and what I personally struggle with is through my the credentials that I explained to the committee earlier, as well as some general familiarity with government processes, feel relatively comfortable in understanding what the ATIP process and the system is, how to make a request. But this is where I go back to and highlight what I was referring to in my remarks is the system must be designed with the most vulnerable type of person in mind. And that could be the 16-year-old who is still in high school. It could be the person who is severely traumatized and wants nothing to do with people in uniform and doesn't understand there's even a website at all. The concerns that I have is that the understanding, if you asked the Chief of Defense Staff or the Minister to conduct a poll of members of the forces to say, what is your comfort and your familiarity with the ATIP system? Do you feel comfortable making these requests? It would not shock me if you had one or two hands in a room full of people and no real genuine understanding of the implications. I think that the problem as well is there's opportunities for people who make such requests to suffer reprisals. People in the forces, when they note the subject matter of the request, the timing of the request, they make guesses as to who has filed those requests, and it would not surprise me if all of a sudden you wouldn't be expecting other administrative actions or changes in things such that in very subtle and hard to detect ways, people are victimized for even just trying to use the system.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I want to thank Mr. White. As someone who's a very strong advocate of mental health from a trauma-informed lens, I agree with you wholeheartedly that we need more of that in a whole-of-government approach in many of the things that we do. If you don't mind, I am going to switch to our other witness now, to Ms. Francoli. Thank you for joining us today and for the work that you do on open government and transparency. You know, in April 2017, you were part of an open letter to the Prime Minister with many of your colleagues and organizations across the country, indicating you wished for real change in the access to information. And you've commented on past witnesses, so you've been kind of following what we've been doing in this study. Do you agree that some of the major changes made in C58 in 2019 are a step in the right direction?
I wouldn't say there's anything fundamentally negative. But I think it was a disappointment to people that are really heavily involved and invested in the access to information regime. Like, so much was happening. There's just been so many studies that say the same thing. And again, it's not that there's a sort of unanimous solution, but there is a lot of commonality. And I think you're seeing it here already with the few witnesses you've had. You're kind of reaching saturation in a way. Like, there's a lot of the same thing being said. And so C58 just didn't revolutionize the system in a way that a lot of people were really hoping it would. So not bad, but just kind of like a bit of a letdown.
Okay, that's fair. You mentioned earlier about the siloed nature of the ATIP system of department by department, and that's certainly something that's come up time and again in our discussions here. And what we're seeing is that IRCC is really getting the lion's share of requests at this time. Would you like to see IRCC officials here, maybe to comment on what they're facing in their ATIP requests that they're getting and how they're managing or struggling with that? You seem like an action-oriented individual and what you'd like to see, so I'd like your thoughts on that.
Very short response, please.
Short, okay. I think that would be really interesting. I mean, they are typically one of the heavy receivers of ATIP requests. They also have a lot of information holdings and a lot of information holdings that aren't digital, so it makes it more complicated to search. And from the Information Commissioner's testimony, I'm understanding that there's maybe some interesting things happening there that could impact the ATIP system moving forward. So I'd be curious, if I were you, to hear more about that. And then I would like to just hear too, so if you could do it, that would be great.
Great. Well,
Thank you, Ms. Sachs. Ms. Francoli, Mr. Villemure.
Mr. Villemure, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Ms. Francoli. Thank you for being with us today. I would like to hear your opinion on the fact that historical documents are not published automatically. Is this something that should be done?
I wouldn't say automatically. There's, a number of things that would prevent historical documents from being published, things related to national security that sit with the Library and Archives, for example, all prevent them from being published. But I will say, and this is, I guess, where I allude to some of the interesting things that the Library and Archives are doing that are outside of the scope of access to information. They've had a very interesting system of block review, trying to go through files and boxes of old things that have not been released and just kind of selectively pick out some to see if those batches contain any information that couldn't be released under the Act. And they've released millions of pages, from what I understand, of documents, historical documents, as a result. So.
But should these documents be classified so that we can find things? Because right now they're kind of in a pile where we can't find anything.
Apologies, my audio cut out here, so I'm...
Absolument.
Should documents be classified in order to facilitate any kind of research? Because sometimes they're available, but it's hard to find things?
So should documents be classified in a way that makes them easier to find? Is that, yeah, I think there's two things that we need to think about. I think the first is thinking about how documents are originally classified. I think that there's been a sort of tendency to overclassify and then, things stay closed. But also, I think it would be useful to look at a system of declassification, and that's something that we're lacking. It's something that the Information Commissioner has published a special report on, and it's something that I know she's mentioned to this committee before, I think in her May testimony to the committee. And she mentioned it to us at the NSTAG as well.
Est-ce qu'on devrait...
You talked about reviewing the way that documents are declassified, but should we examine perhaps how they are classified?
My earpiece is not...
Monsieur le Président?
It was working.
Could you please repeat the question, Mr. Villemur? You mentioned a method for declassifying documents. Should there be a method for classifying documents? Because we know that people tend to overclassify things as a precaution. Should there be a more formal system for classifying documents?
I mean, I think there is a lot of guidance for classifying documents. I just don't think it's always applied evenly across departments and agencies. And it might not always be well known amongst the people that need to be engaged in the classifying of the document in the first place. And so I think it really depends on where it's, like who's classifying, what their level of comfort is in terms of classification. So there's, I think, a system there for determining what level of classification a document should be. My impression is it's probably not applied evenly.
Mais la présence d'un système ou de...
But having a system or a policy doesn't necessarily guarantee the expected results because of how things can be interpreted. Correct?
Yeah.
D'accord. Est-ce que vous croyez...
Do you believe that the Access to Information Act should apply to cabinet confidences?
Yeah, that's a hard one, and I think that's kind of divisive amongst the access community. I think there are a lot of reasons why we want to see that. I also would say that I understand that decision-making in cabinet is not easy, and there needs to be room for discussion and deliberation, and people need to feel free to have difficult discussions, to change their mind, and so I think that one is a little bit complicated. Myself, I can see arguments on both sides, and perhaps that's just an academic wishy-washy answer, but...
Merci, mais écoutez, si...
Thank you. So, should the Information Commissioner be able to see these documents in order to see whether or not these cabinet documents were well classified, if it was over classified or not?
I would say yes. I mean, she doesn't have to release them, and she's very careful about that. But I think it's important that there's an oversight mechanism where somebody can, look at all of the information involved and then, make a decision. So I think that's an important point.
Merci. Monsieur White, en quelques...
Thank you. Mr. White, what would you like to accomplish with your testimony today?
Please, Mr. White.
The first objective, I would say, is a recognition from maybe this committee and anyone interested in the access to information system that there are real barriers to victims and complainants and survivors from accessing essential information that hasn't yet been real part of the conversation. I think steps have been taken, but there is still a lot of things that just no one has clued into as, we wouldn't have thought that might have been a problem. I can share that from both personal experience, but as well from what I've heard from others. The second piece is I think it needs to be looked into farther to get a real sense of either the scope of the problem, creative solutions, because action is really what's needed. It's great that we have the laws in place, but if they're not followed or they're flaunted, then effectively they don't achieve the results needed. So those are two sort of the objectives.
Thank you, Mr. White. Merci, Monsieur Villemure.
Thank you, Mr. Villemure.
You've got 6 minutes.
I actually have a point of order prior to my intervention, sir, if I could.
Okay, go ahead
through you,
with your
Mr.
point.
Chair. I want to note that in the procedure guides to witnesses, that it states testimony before a parliamentary committee is protected by parliamentary privilege. And this means that witnesses enjoy the same freedom of speech and immunity from prosecution or civil liability as members of parliament. I want to ask you, Mr. Chair, if we know for certainty that this would extend to members of the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yes, Mr. Green, it does expand to the witnesses who appear before committees.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you, and I'll now proceed with my round.
I'll start your time now.
Thank you. I do want to begin with Mr. White. Mr. White, if I heard you correctly, you were of the opinion in your opening remarks that your participation here, given the culture of the armed forces, may result in reprisal. Is that correct, sir?
That is correct.
And I won't get into specific details about your current participation as a member. Are you satisfied that what we just read out in terms of your protections would extend to you as a member? Are you satisfied with that? Or do you still believe that the culture of the Department of National Defense would supersede the directions and protections accorded to you by the House of Commons?
I think the simple answer to that question is there are a lot of creative ways that you can suffer reprisals that are not easy to link back to testimony at a committee. It could be administrative. It could be a reassignment of duties. I mean, these are all things that have been flagged throughout Operation Honor as things that victims have faced through coming forward. So with the best I can say is it's nice to hear that there are protections, but protections are only as good as that which you can truly enforce.
Well, I do want you to know, as a member of Parliament, of course, joining my other members here, going beyond just thanking you for your service, that, it's certainly my intention to ensure that your parliamentary privileges as accorded to you by our standing orders as a House of Commons would hopefully suffice in providing you with any kind of protections in terms of whistleblowing. What I do want to do, seeing as how you're coming to this committee with some lived experience perhaps and some anecdotal experience from people you've worked with, could you share, in your opinion, other jurisdictions, other armed forces around the world, which may have, in your opinion, more adequate and suitable whistleblower protections?
The short answer to that question is I would have difficulty pointing to those other organizations, just as it's been outside the scope of what I've studied. But I can say that from what I understand through other experts, perhaps some you have heard it from at committee, or whether you've heard it in the news, that Canada has an atrocious record when it comes to whistleblower protection. There is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for people who come forward. And I can understand that even if members in the forces or in the government broadly are not interested in participating in wrongdoing, they are very willing to look the other way in the interest of maybe putting food on their table or putting their kids through school. So it is incredibly difficult to want to tell anyone that there is any reason or any incentive to come forward unless you have an incredibly strong sense of justice and what is right. But I can assure you that there is no benefit or reward that comes from it. And in fact, my experience has been you get a lot of the opposite.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I want to note, just for the record, that we are in midst of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. In your opening remarks, you certainly raised the specter of a whole host of problems. I think you quite rightly also identified the ongoing investigations into the culture in the most senior levels of the armed forces and the Department of National Defense. And so I want to thank you for that. And I want to hope that this committee can, and I would say, sir, that you have been successful in flagging this as a very real concern. And I don't, in a nonpartisan way, would imagine every member of this committee has taken your testimony to be of the utmost importance and seriousness. I will now reflect on some comments made by Associate Dean Francoli. You mentioned in previous testimony that you were not sure the open by default policy in place in the US will have any significant effect on open data. And I flagged this with some earlier folks about the language that's used. There's kind of a jargon in government that sounds great, a little bit of sloganeering, open by default. I'm just wondering, is your opinion still the same? Is this language around this more words than action when it comes to governments providing more transparency?
I would say here in Canada, when we're talking about open by default and open data, we've seen more movement on open data than open by default. It is tough because it involves a little bit of what Mr. Villeneuve was saying. You have to think about classifications of things in advance. So it's kind of more proactively releasing things and making withholding of information kind of a rarity, limited to things like national security.
I want to give you the
Sorry,
I want to give you the opportunity just to create some definitions because your subject matter expertise is going to be helpful. And if I don't have time accorded to me, then I would ask that you submit it. But in regards to principles of open government, what principles require the greatest improvement given the current access to information regime?
Got about 20 seconds or so.
Okay.
You could, if you're willing to, perhaps maybe submit any written document after this. I just want to make sure that we're defining the term.
I'm happy to submit something written. I'm not sure I can do it justice in 20 seconds, but yeah.
I may have another round, and if I do, I'll come back to you with that question.
Thank you.
You will have another round, Mr. Green. On va commencer avec la
We're going to start with our second round.
Too, that we do have some committee business that we need to deal with. So some of the questioning may be a little bit shorter as we get to the later part of the round. Monsieur Gould, vous avez...
Mr. Gould, you have 5 minutes, please. Thank you. My first question is for Ms. Francoli. We've been talking a lot about transparency. Are there any departments that have shown more transparency than others that we could look to for best practices in your experience in the Government of Canada?
Well, I think they've been really varied, the very different types of initiatives. So I think they're hard to compare in many ways because different departments and agencies are engaging in different functions. So I wouldn't necessarily point to one as kind of being the best. Treasury Board has been leading the open government sort of movement within the government, so that's a good place to look. And I would encourage you to call someone from Treasury Board to maybe talk about the transparency initiatives, the open government partnership, and then, of course, how it relates to the access to information system as well. Access to information kind of was included in some of the early open government work that the Government of Canada engaged in the context of the open government partnership. And then it kind of fell out of place in the open government action plans. I know I'm kind of moving away from your question, but I think it's quite subjective and a bit more nuanced to say someone is doing a lot better or one agency or department's doing much better than the others. Each have their own very different initiatives.
Merci.
Thank you. My next question is for Mr. White. You gave us an exhaustive list of recommendations earlier, and you talked about cases of sexual misconduct, and that could bring about a negative reputation for the Army, and they are having issues with recruitment. Do you believe that your recommendations could help improve their image and indirectly improve their recruitment issues?
Merci pour votre question.
Thank you for the question.
I certainly believe that establishing confidence, not just through words, but through concrete actions, you can turn a recruitment crisis into a recruiting success. The best spokespeople for the Canadian Armed Forces should be victims who have said, I have been heard, action has been taken, and I strongly encourage every other person who is listening to this to join the forces. But instead, the response in many cases seems to be reprisals, dismissal, denial of information. To be honest, wouldn't possibly expect to receive notifications soon that the Naval Reserve is organizing to have me released from the Canadian Armed Forces. So I don't understand. I've personally tried to share ideas, even on subjects such as how to promote our military history and recognition of Canada's armed forces amongst the general public. And I can't say that many people in the department, especially the ones with higher authority, have ever really expressed interest in at least my ideas. And I certainly hope that that isn't the case for others, but I'm getting the impression that it is.
I'm going to come back to Ms. Francoli. If you had 1, 2, or 3 main recommendations to give the committee, what would they be?
That's a good question. I have a kind of a list here. They go beyond that, but just reinforcing what others have said. The need for really good information management and looking at information management systems, including, as one of the previous witnesses said, storage, retrieval, things like digitization strategies of documents to deal with, the paper holdings that we have, ensuring access to old files. This kind of helps to build the cornerstone for good access to information, proper resourcing, a declassification strategy, limiting exemptions, and these are all things I know that you've heard before. Good leadership, more proactive disclosure, and I could keep going on. Better education on the use of access to information and how to make requests, and that's something I know you've heard before as well, and I was thinking of that as Mr. White was talking as well. There's no one to really help you figure out this complicated system if you want to make an access to information request yourself. It's immensely complicated, so...
See, Mr. Gore.
Thank you, Mr. Gould.
Mr. Baines, online, you have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our guests for joining us today. And Mr. White, thank you for your service and for coming forward and sharing. Actually, I just wanted to start with you. If I can ask if there's any sexual assault cases that you feel that have not been pursued because the victim could not get access to the information they need?
That's a very difficult question for me to be able to answer outside of my own experience. But I'm fortunate enough to be able to confirm to you that absolutely yes. It has been very difficult, and I assure you that without going into further details at this time, that justice has not been served in my own personal circumstances. And in fact, I have recently received information that the leadership of the Naval Reserve may be positioning to make things worse by shutting down further investigations and other things. So rest assured, if it's happened in my case, I would, the old expression, what, dollars to donuts? It's happened to other times, I'm sure.
Thank you for bringing that forward. I will move to the Associate Dean Francoli. In your experience, what challenges exist in ensuring the integrity and safety of the data that individuals provide to either a company or, in this case, a government? Like, what safeguards need to be built into design phase of an application to ensure it will protect users' data?
So, sorry, do you mean with the access to information request form itself, or?
Yes.
I think, yeah, I'm not sure I'm well placed to answer that one in terms of protecting users. For that one, I would suggest you might want to talk to the privacy commissioner. I noticed that that commissioner hasn't been here yet. But I mean, protecting the privacy of the request, I mean, the personal information, I mean, it's kind of a first come, first serve system, right? The analysts are supposed to be addressing them as they come in and not kind of classifying types of requests. I'm not sure I'm exactly getting at what you're asking.
I'll move on. So your research has focused on the way digital media has impacted three broad areas: citizen engagement and mobilization, governance, and access to information and data. How has digital media impacted access to information?
I think it's had an enormous impact. I mean, part of the issue that we face with our Access to Information Act is that it predates digital. So, I mean, it was designed in a very different mediascape than we operate in today. And so as a result, instead of kind of starting from scratch and building a piece of legislation that really reflects the contemporary digital media landscape and the types of information holdings that we have, we're trying to patch up, this old piece of legislation and make it relevant to the digital era. And that's tough. So, when we look at the Center for Law and Democracy's ratings of various access to information legislations around the world, some of the ones that we see that come out ahead of us are ones that are new. They've been developed, to deal with these issues really explicitly. So just the level of information and data that we have available to us now, the way that we store and way that we fail to keep up information and data holdings as technologies change, as software changes. I mean, it just makes it really, really difficult to have good information management. And as I said earlier, that's really the foundation of being able to employ the Act successfully.
Okay, and this could be for both of you. One of our previous witnesses, Monsieur Drapeau, suggested changes to Information Commissioner to help speed up the process of ETHI, specifically to introduce a one-year period before complaints can be brought before a federal court. What are your thoughts on his analysis?
We have like 5 seconds, Mr. Baines.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Sorry. Their chance, 2.5 minutes for the Liberals, but we're
going to move to Mr. Villemure for 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Francoli, do you believe that there are other countries that might have best practices for access to information?
It's tough because the country context matters so much when you're talking about access to information. So, for example, I mean, when we're talking about digital government, but often Estonia is referred to. The old CIO used to talk about Estonia a lot. There was like a little, kind of Estonia craze there for a while. And there's tons of interesting things happening there. But for us, it just doesn't compare. Like, Canada's so much bigger. Our division of power makes it really complicated. So I think there's things, of course, we can learn from other countries, but we have to be careful not to just adopt what works well in another country. We need to make sure that it actually works for us, for our unique national context. And one of the things... Sorry.
I'm going to have to interrupt you because we don't have a lot of time, but do you believe that the GDPR or the Australia example could be interesting?
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting to look at other Commonwealth countries. Again, the context here, even though we're other part of the Commonwealth, is still a little bit different. One of the things that makes things a bit different for us, and this relates to access to information and to open government more broadly, but is our Official Language Act. So that's a sort of unique country context that impacts our information holdings and disclosure that like Australia is not dealing with in the same way.
Pourriez-vous préciser?
Could you specify the difficulties?
I think, the difficulties are we want, if I think about open government initiatives, to release information in both official languages at the same time. Oftentimes, the Official Language Act is actually used as, it's kind of held up as an impediment to openness in government and to further transparency. Well, we can't do it because we don't have it translated yet. It's too expensive to translate it, so we can't release this information. And so I think that the Act has been used as a mechanism to circumvent transparency in some cases.
Merci beaucoup. La question des langues.
Thank you. It'll be a difficult issue to solve. Thank you.
Matt, Mr. Green, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Associate Dean Francoli, I would love the opportunity for you to be able to address the questions in regards to the principles of open government. What principles require the greatest...
Excuse me, Mr. Green, can you turn on your camera, please? We can't see you. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My apologies for that. I want to return to Associate Dean Francoli. In regards to the principles of open government, what principles require the greatest improvement given the current access to information regime in Canada?
So open government is really founded on the ideas of accountability and access to information and civic engagement. I would say that those are kind of the three big things that underpin open government. I think we have a lot of civic and citizen participation opportunities, and they've been changing, and I think there's been an effort to improve the way that citizens are engaged. I think access to information is still the big one. In the first couple of action plans to the Open Government Partnership, there were more commitments made around access to information, but I think it's just such a difficult one to move forward, and I think that this kind of, alludes to some of the disappointment I mentioned earlier around C-58. So, it's hard for public servants to move forward as well and to get buy-in on change related to access to information. They kind of stop being included, different commitments on access to information within the action plans. So for me, anyway, improvements to access to information itself is kind of the big principle of open government that we need to improve here in Canada.
And what would that look like specifically if you had some examples for this committee?
I think it would look like a much more significant reform to the Access to Information Act than we currently have. And I think if we were being really ambitious, we would establish a transparency strategy that would bring all of these different sorts of open government and transparency initiatives together so that we could see how they work with one another. There's all kinds of interesting things happening across the Government of Canada, a lot of hard work that's being put in to open government. All of that's outside of the scope of the Act, but I think, over time, hopefully, it will help to ease some pressure on the access to information system.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. We do have 2.5-minute rounds scheduled. We are running over time here. I'll just remind the committee, Mr. Tukurik, you have 2.5 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll keep this short. First, thank you, Mr. White, again for your service, and just to emphasize that access to information is not simply about, government accountability, but it has, as we're hearing from your testimony, it directly relates to ensuring that government cannot cover up, in your case, things related to ensuring that victims get justice. So thank you for that. And Dean Francoli, appreciate your testimony, and just to note the namesake of the college that you are dean of is proud to be born in Battle River Crowfoot. So glad to have you before the committee. Simply to ask two quick questions, and I've asked all of our witnesses this question, these questions thus far, and it is simply, and a yes or no answer will suffice. So I'll start with you, Mr. White. Is a functioning, strong access to information system needed in a modern democracy? Just yes or no is great.
Yes, imperative.
Okay, and Dean Francoli.
That's that's really kind, but I anticipated this question looking at previous meetings. But yes, I would agree too.
Okay, and in anticipation, the next one is: do you give Canada's current access to information system a passing grade? Again, we'll start with Mr. White.
No, and I think the victims and their experiences speak for themselves on that point.
Okay, thank you very much, and Associate Dean, and maybe one day soon, Dean Francoli.
I don't know if I want that job, but I would say if I think of the system in a bigger way than just access to information legislation, I would say we pass. If you're asking specifically about the Access to Information Act, I would say no, we have a ton of work to do.
Okay. With that, Mr. Chair, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kirk, under time, which is appreciated. Next 2.5 minutes, final intervention, Ms. Khalid.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. White and Associate Dean Francoli. I'll be really brief with my question. And I have asked other witnesses we've heard in this committee about that the majority of ETHI requests are individual file-based, for example, within immigration departments or others where there are concerns with individual claimants, etc. Now, I want to know from you, Associate Dean Francoli, how do you think that impacts the overall functioning of the ETHI system? Does it take away from the function of ETHI when there are thousands upon thousands of claims filed that may be impeding that access to information by people that may actually need that access?
Yeah, I think it creates a huge stress on the system, and I think it's sad that people don't have access to their information without going through an access to information request, which can be very complicated to navigate. And I think if we're thinking about who is filing a lot of the requests, so it's IRCC, that is one of the biggest recipients, CRA, one of the biggest recipients. And again, going back to Mr. White's point, we're talking about, in many cases, people, vulnerable people that would be needing to access that information, right? So I think that it's a very sad state that people feel they have to go there, and that's why I would be really curious to hear about what IRCC is doing in particular to help ensure people can have the information they need without going through this process.
Thank you. And is there a recommendation that you would propose to this committee to include as part of the report as to how to deal with claims or requests for access to information that maybe shouldn't have to go through that process, or that could be deemed vexatious or malicious in its intent?
I mean, I think that, those are kind of different things. So to me, if you're trying to access your own information or access information about a file you have with IRCC, for example, that's not vexatious. I mean, that's just, you're trying to get something done and move forward something yourself. And, if you can't do that, I think there should be a, complaints mechanism in addition to just being able to launch an access to information request. Vexatious requests are obviously a very specific thing, and there is a mechanism, as you know, I'm sure, under the current legislation for the Information Commissioner to kind of step in there.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Khalid. Thank you, Ms. Francoli. Mr. White, for your appearance today in front of the committee. On behalf of all Canadians, I want to say thank you. And Mr. White, I know it's been said several times, but thank you for your service to our nation. On behalf of a grateful nation, we very much appreciate that service, Ms. Francoli. I'm going to suspend for a minute. We do have some committee business that we need to get to give our witnesses an opportunity to leave. So the committee is suspended for 1 minute. call the committee to order. I understand, Mr. Green, that you do have a motion you want to present. I'm going to get to you in a second, if you don't mind. There's a couple of things I want to bring up. First of all, the budgets. We have study budgets that need to be adopted. There's two of them that have been put before you. Roxham Road for $2,425 and the ATIP study for $10,150. I would like to include the ArriveCan study in that approval process. It's come in, according to the clerk, at $8,950. So if I can have consensus on the part of the committee members to adopt those study budgets. Mr. Fergus, everybody good? Thumbs up, Mr. Green? Okay, so we'll consider those budgets adopted. Just for the sake of the committee, again, before I get to you, Matt, just as far as the upcoming meetings, here's what we have scheduled so far. And I will admit to some difficulty in procuring some witnesses. I don't know whether it's the time of year. I know that, obviously there's been American Thanksgiving. We've had some challenges with some of the requests for witnesses from representatives from Amazon, for example. But this Wednesday, we have scheduled to continue with the ArriveCan study. We've got one witness that has been confirmed. We did invite Amazon. They have said no, and we have invited a witness to be confirmed as well, Tech Systems. Monday, December 5th, we're scheduled to recommence with the ATIP study. We've got ATIP coordinators from Global Affairs Canada that have been confirmed, to be confirmed, but have been invited. Our ATIP coordinators from the RCMP, Public Safety, and the PCO. Wednesday, December 7th is an ATIP study. We do have members that have been confirmed, witnesses that have been confirmed that are going to be, we have 3 witnesses that are going to appear in front of the committee on December 7th. So I just wanted to bring that to the committee's attention. I have Mr. Green first. Is this a point?
It's about what you're.
This is pertaining to your intervention.
Okay. So I'm going to go to Mr. Barrett, if that's okay, Mr. Green?
Yeah, so my question is about what you just raised. So in talking about getting witnesses, you said that one of the witnesses that we invited said no?
I've received confirmation tonight that they said no.
Well, Chair, I think that I'd just like to take a quick second here, if I can, that we requested that a witness appear. The witness is a contractor for the Government of Canada. They've received millions of dollars of taxpayer money, and to not say, well, we've got some time, there's a challenge, but to say no to a parliamentary committee, it's absolutely unacceptable.
Point of order, Chair.
Go ahead on your point.
I know that it's common practice for us to discuss individual witnesses while we're in camera. I just want to note that we are in public right now, and I think it's improper to talk about specific witnesses in public.
Okay, I would agree. I would agree with Ms. Khalid on that.
I'll move that we take the meeting in camera then to discuss.
Point of order.
Mr. Green has a. Okay, so. Mr. Barrett, I'm going to go to Mr. Green first because I appreciate your intervention, but Mr. Green did acknowledge to me that he did want to go first. I thought it was on this. Mr. Green, if you want to go, please.
Mr. Chair, I say this with the utmost respect, for your guidance in this committee. You brought this issue to the committee in an open forum. There is nothing pursuant to our standing orders that would require us to go in camera. What we have is a refusal of an organization to come before this committee. I'm not sure that there is anything within the parameters of a discussion that we would have. These are procedural questions. We talked about parliamentary privilege. We are the Grand Inquisitor of the nation. We have the power to send for people, documents, and evidence. And so I would say that, sir, if it is the intention of a motion to move in camera, which I believe is what is required to be procedurally in order, that the motion be brought to this committee and that we vote accordingly, because I would like to go on the record and say I have no interest in having any conversations about Amazon be had in camera, given their reluctance, and not reluctance, their refusal, sir, to come to this committee. So I would ask for that vote to happen.
So just to be clear, Mr. Green, and for Mr. Barrett's benefit too, it wasn't an outright refusal. There was the scheduling issues that they indicated as being the problem for this Wednesday. So, I would ask the committee's indulgence to perhaps ask them for another opportunity to come to committee. And I think that would be appropriate, but the indication that I've got from the clerk is that they had scheduling issues. So I don't want to go too far into the weeds on this one. Go ahead, Mr. Barrett.
Very briefly, if I can, Mr. Chair, I am willing to take a step back on this, but then I would ask that in going back to them with another date, that that the clerk be asked to remind the witness of that the committee does have the powers to send for people, papers, and evidence, and that we do hope that they respond to our invitation so that it can be on those terms.
Fair point. Fair point, Mr. Barrett. Okay. I am going to go to Mr. Green now. Mr. Green.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I do have a motion that has been sent to the clerks and I believe also sent to the P9s of members of committee. It's a housekeeping issue, Mr. Chair. I think we all received correspondence of some of the frustrations that people are having around the scheduling. And I want to say before I move this motion that for those that are watching, this is not in any way, shape, or form reflective of our clerks' attempts and abilities to schedule people. This is not in any way, shape, or form an attempt to minimize this study or to undervalue the expert testimony. This is just a situation that we have that's seasonal. So, Mr. Chair, that in order to allow for witnesses to be scheduled with sufficient notice and time for preparation, the committee pause its study on the access to information until January 30th, 2023, and that the committee invite the Commissioner of Lobbying of Canada and the Privacy Commissioner of Canada and the Information Commissioner of Canada to appear as a part of a study on supplementary estimates B for the 2022-2023 year, and that the commissioners appear at committee no later than December 6, 2022. So for obvious reasons, Mr. Chair, we have to have the subs dealt with here, and this would be a good opportunity to invite these folks while we allow our clerk to go out across the country and adequately schedule subject matter expertise for ATIP study in a way that I think is reflective of the seriousness and importance of the study.
Thank you, Mr. Green. The motion is in order. There's a couple of issues that I do want to bring up to you and to other members of the committee. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a couple of ATIP study witnesses or meetings that have scheduled witnesses to appear. These are witnesses that were asked to appear, and the only time that they could be scheduled, for example, was December 7th. So we do have those meetings already in place. I guess the clarification that I would need from you, Mr. Green, is do you want the commissioners, all three of them, to come in a singular meeting on the sub-Bs? The other thing that I would propose to you as well is that the deadline, we don't know, it could be as early as later this week. And the committee can always consider the subject of the supplementary estimates at a later date. We can do that. And the other thing that I would remind the committee as well. So I just need clarification from you whether you want all three here at the same time, or do you want them separately? Because separately, we can accommodate to have them here, all three of them at the same time, but separately would take up 3 different meetings, Mr. Green.
So to your first point, I would say that I feel that the ATIP study is best scheduled in a lexical order that helps us provide, the most important primary testimonies first. I find that it's helpful in studies, particularly of this nature, to be informed by, subject matter expertise, government staff, ministers, that type of thing up front, and then kind of get into other more ancillary witnesses. And I'm not sure that was the case, and I say that respectfully in terms of today's intervention. And so I would say that we do put it on pause until the new year, and then allow the clerk and yourself, sir, to work out a work plan that has a very lexical, to the best of our ability, a lexical order of operations. As it relates to the commissioners, I mean, I'm certainly fine to have them all in one meeting, but I would leave that up to the discussion of the people, of the other committee members around the table.
Okay, so the challenge, so the motion is on the floor for debate, but I'll go back to you, and this is where I need clarity, because we do have witnesses that are already scheduled to appear. Those schedules have been accommodated for December 5th and December 7th. And so if with this proposal we put off these meetings, then we're also going to be putting off those witnesses who, by my understanding, are anxious to appear and have made their schedules available for those 2 dates. So that's the challenge that I have. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, are they ministers that are coming?
No.
Are they senior government staffers that are coming?
They are, I don't have their backgrounds in front of me, Mr. Green, to be fair, but just give me a second, would you?
Sure.
Okay, so I just got some clarification from the clerk. We have senior government officials that are coming on December 5th, first from Global Affairs Canada. And on Wednesday, we have reporters that are coming to speak on December 7th, reporters to speak about the ATIP issue. So there was attempts that were made to accommodate their schedules earlier. This was the earliest and most viable date that they could come. So that's how the schedule was made out, Mr. Green.
Well, then I would say, Mr. Chair, without trying to be difficult, then by all means, if it's the will of the committee that we pursue in those 2 days, that's fine. I just received, like we all did, some frustration from the public that they felt that this was being rushed and that folks weren't getting adequate notice. I want to go on the record today to assure people that is not the case, that we will work through this study thoughtfully and give people the ability to prepare. If you've already done that for those 2 days, then I would totally concede that point and be amenable to bumping that date to allow, or bumping the date within the context of this to allow for that to happen.
Okay, Mr. Green, just again for clarity, I am certainly not adverse to inviting the commissioners. If we wanted to do so, we could probably do it on December 12th at our scheduled meeting if you would like to do that. I can accept the motion, but the no later than December 6th. I think if we put a date on it as December 12th, then why don't we look at that then, okay? Okay, so I see a thumbs up from Mr. Green. I also see Mr. Kurik's hand up.
Yeah, just to acknowledge if we go too much longer here, I think there will be a resource issue. So I'd be happy to move an amendment that whatever the clerk feels and is amenable to Mr. Green. I agree with the spirit of his motion. So however we can ensure that we get that sorted and then make sure we're not taking away resources from other committees as well.
Sorry, Mr. Kurik. I was just talking to the clerk there. Could you repeat what you just said? Sorry about that.
Let's just get it sorted.
Okay.
I'm supportive of the motion, so if an amendment is needed, count me in as long as it's in spirit with what Mr. Green's motion is. But I'm concerned if we drag this out too long, other committees will be affected.
Let's, so if it's okay with you, Mr. Green, we're looking at December 12th as having the commissioners come in to look at the supplementary estimates, correct? Okay. Are we good with that? Members are good with that? Nous sommes en accord, Monsieur Villemure?
Mr. Villemure, yes.
Yeah, so the last thing, I see your hand, Mr. Fergus. The last thing I want to bring to the attention of the committee is that we received a letter from the commissioner on the new edition of the Lobbyist Code of Conducts. So it's not an order of reference from the House, but if members, we're welcome to study that in the future if we need to. I know that the Commissioner has made herself available, or as said, in December, I believe, at some point. So it's something to consider, maybe not right now, but for later, that we may want to have the Commissioner here to discuss that as well. Okay, so Mr. Fergus, I saw your hand. No? I will be adjourning the meeting, and I thank everybody for your patience. This is my fault, this late hour, and I'll tell you why, because I was really benevolent in the time on that first panel. I was actually listening more than I was watching my clock, okay? So that won't happen again. The meeting's adjourned.
Let the record show he will not.